Hello, welcome back to the Retire While You Work podcast. I'm Myles Zuger, advisor here on the team, joined by Carson, another advisor here on the team, and Jeri Anne, our director of operations on the team. And we're going to be continuing on with our young adult series, talking about maybe some big decisions that young adults face in their early 20s into their late 20s, early 30s, and talking through some of those as hopefully some helpful tips or things to consider when facing those big decisions. Because I think if you have no place to start or maybe nobody that you can talk to, it can feel a little daunting. And so it's always nice just to have maybe some advice you can think about or talk with your friends about for how to navigate these decisions that, again, can be pretty daunting and seem like a lot to chew on at the time. Any thoughts from you guys, just kind of kicking it off here on maybe what you guys do when you have a big life decision coming up or a big financial decision? Like, where do you even start? Do you start with getting all the information, trying to talk it through? Each of you kind of
looking back in my life whenever I was growing up, kind of my first big major decision, at least with financial implications, other than college, was moving out and starting to rent and then buying a home a year later. I moved out, my sophomore year of college, and got married soon after that. So the rent was the first big major financial implication, as well as followed that up with buying a home. And also in there was getting my first credit card. So there's a lot of different angles there, a lot of big implications, but I wanted to make note on the first part, which was the first time I ever got a credit card. That was one of those things where that was the first time I ever kind of established line of credit in my personal name. I had never had anything growing up. Between that and also utilities, I think, are technically tied to your credit to some degree, maybe. So that credit card was something that I, at the time, didn't think too much about. I was just like, okay, student credit card, let me start building my credit. Sure. But looking back, I think it was really valuable, the fact that I did get a credit card, a student credit card, to start building my credit, because I still have that. And I mean, it's been so many years of great credit history for myself since starting that. And that was really important.
And I think even backing up a little bit on that is to talk about, I mean, a lot of people don't even understand about what a credit score is and why it's important. And if you're talking about big purchases and like even buying a car, they're going to run your credit score. And what that means is basically, have you always paid your bills on time? What's your debt to income ratio? It's different things like that. And there's actually a score tied to you as a person, to your social security number, that allows lenders to see how much of a risk you are to lend money to. That's yeah. So if you're one day just like, oh, I think I'm going to buy a car or a house, and you've never really had anything to build that credit up, you're probably going to have some issues if you're not just paying cash, and not many young people are just paying cash.
I think it's a great practice to get a credit card when you're in college to start building credit, but with the caveat that you have to pay attention to it. It's not just something you can get and then start swiping away and forget about it. You've got one, I think, there's a plethora of labeled student credit cards out there that have no annual fee. They have a really low credit limit, but that's okay. It's honestly to protect you. And what I did, my practice was, I literally put gas on it every single week. I think back then I was spending $20 a week in gas. So I would put gas on it. And then every month I'd pay off the balance of $120 or whatever it was. Or maybe I put my eating out on there too. So it was never anything, a crazy balance. Paid it off after the month was over. And that was it. I basically never carried a balance on the credit card, but it was a way for me to start my credit history and also get a good history of never missing your payments, never having a late payment, that sort of thing. So I think that's one of the best things you can do.
It also helps. Yeah, it also helps is the longer you have that account open. So if you're not using it, that's fine, because it's helping your credit ultimately. If you just keep it open and you do use it occasionally and pay it off on time, that really helps. But
I was going to say, yeah, even if I feel like a lot of young people have debit cards, which are obviously just tied to your checking account, and kind of to Carson's points, like even if you just open a credit card and obviously don't go crazy with it, like he said, but if you have like a $500 limit on it, so that meaning like if you try to spend $600 on that thing, it's going to get rejected because you don't have enough credit. So it's a safe way to kind of put guardrails on that for you. And then if you go buy, groceries and you spend $100 at the grocery store, if you go in 3 days, like go in 3 days later and pay that off, almost treat it like a debit card, but use it as a credit card so that you're building that credit over the long term to really get that.
And for people out there that have school loans as young people, if you're paying those school loans, that's building your credit. Just always pay those on time as well. That kind of leads us into leasing, to renting an apartment or something, because a lot of those places now also check your credit before they'll let you lease an apartment. And then there's, lease or buy. So if you're ready for a mortgage or not, those are two big decisions.
I think a great first step, especially if you're just coming out of college, looking to maybe you got a job, maybe it's a new city, maybe it's the same city you were born and raised or grew up in. I think it's great to rent for a year, even if you just pump the brakes on buying a home, even if it might be a good investment one day. I think renting allows you to understand the flow of what life is like after college because it is very different. You can understand your location relative to where you're going to be working and the commute that's involved, where you end up spending your time, the friendships that you have. I think it's great to rent just for a year so that you can get to know your location and ultimately know where you might want to buy a residence because you're a little bit more locked in with a permanent residence. Yes, you can sell it one day, but you're getting a mortgage. It's a little bit more hardcore of a financial decision rather than just leasing, because typically with leases, it's over a 1 year basis. And the financial implications as far as upfront goes aren't as severe as purchasing a home. So that's my advice. Straight out of college, rent for a year before you're thinking about buying a home.
And it prepares you, sorry, Myles, it prepares you for when you want to buy, because it teaches you things like you've got to pay all of your utilities. You got to get all that set up. You might want renter's insurance, which is similar to homeowner's insurance. I mean, there's a lot of little things that you learn as a renter that will prepare you eventually as a home buyer.
And I recommend, to Carson's point, I mean, for young people, maybe moving to a new city, first job, don't really know where they want to live or are trying to figure it out. I even recommend to, people in their 30s and 40s, if they're moving to a new city for a new job, like don't rush into buying a home. Like if it's a brand new city to you, you don't know like where you're going to be spending your time, like what part of town, especially a city like Nashville where there's different pockets of neighborhoods and they're all a little bit different. And I feel like a lot of people kind of end up hanging out in one or two of them a lot and not even really going to the other ones. And so you realize like where you're spending your time, where you want to be. It just allows you to make that decision without buying a home in a part of town that you like, but it's like not where you spend all your time. Then you're driving across town all the time. And so it just allows you to figure that out without planning routes that are, depending on what the housing market's doing, it can be hard to get out of that purchase. And so it's like, just take a year and figure things out for yourself.
Mindset that, renting is a waste of money. No, it's not. There's so much. Could you buy a home and it go up in value and you miss out on those gains? Sure, that can happen. But renting is not a waste of money. You're not just throwing money away. There's so many other valuable benefits other than just dollars that go into renting for a period of time.
And so talking about renting a home or buying a home, there's also, buying a car is a big purchase once you do that for the first time on your own. There's also an option to lease a car. Those are kind of two decisions that it may be a little cheaper a month to lease a car, but there's a lot of things tied to that lease that you have to be careful with. I don't know if y'all want to touch on that a little bit.
Sure. When it comes to a vehicle purchase, probably 9 times out of 10, probably higher, it's not going to make sense financially to lease a vehicle. You end up, A, you have to put money down, and then B, you have to have a larger monthly payment, and then C, you don't get to keep the car at the end of the lease. You have the option to potentially purchase it. So I would focus on the vehicle side of things. If you need a new car, get something used, get something a little bit older, and don't worry about a lease just because unless you can truly afford it, you have a bunch of extra cash flow, you're saving in your buckets, 1, 2, and 3. Don't worry about a lease. Let that be kind of your last resort, just because they're usually not the best for your family.
Right. I mean, sometimes people later in life will do a lease, but I mean, there are different scenarios when a lease is okay because
Sure.
say you live right by your office, you don't drive your car a lot. The payments usually are cheaper, although you've put some money down. But yeah,
That's
that's buying something over leasing is always, I think, a better deal.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, it kind of comes back to like Jeri, to your point. If you're going to be driving, 30,000 miles a year, like the lease isn't even in the cards for you because usually there's 10 or maybe 12,000 miles a year limits on those things. But if you're not driving super far and you're somebody who likes to drive new cars, maybe you do get a new car every 2 or 3 years. That's kind of like the circumstances. Leases make sense. I think we always say like, if you're somebody who keeps cars for 7 years, you're probably better off just going ahead and buying it. And if you're somebody who, gets a car every 2 or 3 years, you're probably better off to lease it.
On the renting side of things, I think the biggest thing to remember if you're going to find an apartment is obviously you're going to have the monthly payment, but you're also probably going to have to put up a big security deposit, which is usually 1 month's rent on average. So just know you could have to pay your first month's rent, double that because you're also putting down a security deposit. And if you're doing the first half of a month, they might require that too. Like if you started February 15th, they might require you to do the rest of February, all of March, and your security deposit. So that can be a pretty large chunk of money. But it's probably going to be a lot less than purchasing a home because you're going to have a down payment and closing costs that are associated there.
I was just saying, understanding like what's in the lease, like don't be afraid to ask questions if you're unsure of something. Like you should understand what that says, like what the lease says and what you're responsible for and what you're not responsible for. Especially, I mean, apartments can be different, but if you're like renting a home, like know if you're responsible for trash and cutting the grass and things like that.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say too about the utilities. Know what utilities are there. I mean, a lot of people don't know. Is there gas, heat, or whatever? You've got to get all of that stuff over into your name so you can pay those bills. And what were you just saying, Myles, about and the lease, knowing like what you're responsible for. And that's a good thing sometimes as a renter because you're not responsible for a lot of the stuff that can go wrong in a house or a condo or an apartment that you would have to be responsible for if you owned it. But it's kind of nice if something happens, just calling the landlord, hey, our garbage disposal stopped working or whatever it is. And that just also, just to be safe, it's usually a good idea. And some of them require that you have renter's insurance. So that means if someone came into your apartment or there was a fire, somebody came in and, there was a burglary or whatever, you're covered with that renter's insurance. And it's not very expensive.
I was gonna say that too. I mean, if you're renting a place, you should have renter's insurance. I think it's like, I don't like under, I would say it's definitely under $500 a year, but it would literally replace everything through theft or fire, or whatever it might be. So it's worth having that. And then on the utilities thing, I think, one thing you can always do too is before you rent a place is ask to see maybe like the last year's history of utilities to see like, are things super expensive in the wintertime when you're running the heat, or are they more expensive in the summer when you're running the air conditioning? It just kind of gives you an idea of what you can expect those bills to be over the course of a year. So you have some sort of idea for yourself.
Yeah, it's good. I know on the home side of things, if you're going to go through and maybe you've found a home and you're planning on moving in, or you're going to have, move in with a friend or have a renter with you alongside you, there is a lot more costs associated to owning a home rather than just renting, even just with utilities. There's a lot of things that you don't even think about, like a pest control fee. You got to make sure you change the air filters. You got to check your dryer vents. I mean, the list goes on as far as home maintenance, your gutters. I mean, you name it. The list goes on and on and on about a home. So just be aware mentally that there's a lot of extra tasks that go into owning a home. Not to say it's not worth it. I love, those are all great things and can add value to your home and things that you can appreciate doing to your home to make it feel like a home. But just be aware of those things. It's not free. And there's a lot of other hidden costs that you may not think about.
And you certainly don't want to end up being house poor either, which means don't really, if you really want to buy a house, but you're not really there with the money and you're really going to stretch it on that payment, I mean, just think that through, because you don't want to have this great house and then no money after that.
Yeah. And make sure your emergency fund is in place, because God forbid you buy a home and then within a year the AC unit goes out because it's an older home or something like that, and you got to fork up $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. You want to make sure that you're prepared for that so you don't have to go backwards. So, a home, you're going to have money for a down payment, have money for closing costs, have money for an emergency fund, and also be willing and ready for all those extra expenses that come up. Not to mention that property taxes, homeowners insurance, they tend to go up every single year. So your mortgage payment can slowly go up because usually those things are paid through escrow.
Yeah, because with like renter's insurance, you might be looking at a couple $100 a year. Homeowners insurance, you're probably looking at a couple $1,000s a year. I mean, depending on the house, obviously, but you're starting to get into the thousands of dollars and things like that. So the costs definitely go up. And if you're buying a new home, always get an inspection. I know sometimes people don't. If it's a new house, they feel like they don't need to get an inspection, but I mean, that $300, $400, $500, whatever it is, under $1,000 you might spend could save you tens of thousands of dollars at some point just by doing, if nothing else, it's peace of mind when you're going into a big purchase like that. Anything else? Any other kind of tips when you're working? I feel like those are the biggest life decisions people, especially young adults, are going to work through. I mean, all these kind of come after college. But then it kind of comes into house and cars and things that you need. And so I think these are some of the bigger ones people face, especially early on in their early 20s coming out of college.
All good things, all great things to be walking towards. I think the biggest thing that the takeaway from this is just do your due diligence and analyze your financial situation. Make sure that you can afford it. Truly make sure that you can afford it. And go high whenever you're budgeting these expenses. Talk to people, talk to parents, friends who already own a home or are renting, what their costs are like, just so that you can be the most prepared that you can be, and you don't end up in a situation where you have to pull out debt or go backwards.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us here on this episode. We're talking about work on big life decisions, and feel free to comment if you maybe have an experience you want to share with some of our viewers and listeners, and it might provide some context and get a good chat going. So thanks again for listening, and give us a follow, and we'll see you next week.
Any opinions are those of myself and not necessarily those of Raymond James. Expressions of opinion are as of this date and are subject to change without notice. The information contained in these podcasts do not purport to be a complete description of the securities market or developments referred to in this material. The information has been obtained from sources considered to be reliable, but we do not guarantee that the foregoing material is accurate or complete. Every investor's situation is unique, and you should consider your investment goals, risk tolerance, and time horizon before making any investment. Prior to making an investment decision, please consult with your financial advisor about your individual situation. Any hypothetical examples are for illustration purposes only. Actual investor results will vary. Raymond James does not provide legal or tax services. Please discuss these matters with the appropriate professional.